The chair beneath him creaked every time he shifted his weight, so he stopped shifting. He learned to sit as still as the furniture, to let the minutes pass without provoking the. A wall clock ticked with an insultingly steady confidence. Tick, tick, tick. Not loud, not urgent, just present, like a drip you can't unhear once you've noticed it. Someone had once tried to fix it by lifting the glass and touching the hands with 2 fingers, as if time would obey the pressure of skin. It hadn't. The air smelled faintly of metal and old paper, ink, oil, damp wool drying too slowly. The kind of smell that settled into a place and stayed there, no matter how often the windows were open. Across the table, a man folded and unfolded a pencil between his thumb and forefinger, not writing, not deciding, just turning it end over end, like a tiny drill boring into his patience. Every so often the pencil tapped the wood, one soft knock, then a pause, then another. He seemed to be measuring something with, not distance, not numbers, waiting. In the corner, a stove made a low, tired sound as it cooled. A hiss, then a sigh. Someone had fed it earlier when it seemed useful to do useful things. Now it was simply another object going through the motions. A telephone sat on a side table as if it had been placed there for display. The receiver lay perfectly on its cradle, its cord coiled like a sleeping snake. They kept glancing at it anyway, the way people glance at a closed door when they know footsteps are coming. No one spoke in full sentences. Words were too complete, too committed. They traded fragments, half questions that died before they reached the air, and answers that didn't answer anything. Still nothing? Not yet. Should have been here by now. It'll come. It always comes, someone said, and then immediately regretted the certainty in the phrase. He cleared his throat, as if he could swallow it back down. A pen rolled a few inches on the tabletop and stopped. The sound of its tiny movement made everyone look up, as if the room itself had shifted. Nothing else followed. The same stillness resumed, thick as cloth. Outside, a vehicle passed at a slow pace, rubber on wet ground, chains clinking softly. The sound was muffled, as if the world had wrapped itself in blankets. Somewhere farther off, a door opened and shut. A boot scuffed. Then silence again. He rubbed his palms together once, then stopped. The skin on his hands was dry, cracked at the knuckles. He had been washing them too often without realizing it, the way men do when they don't know where to put the unease. The motion left a faint dust of chalky skin on his trousers. He brushed it away carefully, as if being neat could keep things orderly. On the table sat a cup of tea gone cold. A thin skin had formed over the surface, trembling when the floor vibrated with distant movement. He watched that skin for a moment, watching the tiny tremors ripple through it, proof that something in the building was alive and moving even if the room refused to. A man by the window lifted the curtain the width of 2 fingers, looked out, and lowered it again. He did it with the same precision each time, as if he were practicing, as if the view might change if he repeated the ritual enough times. He didn't announce what he saw. He didn't need to. The others could read the absence of words. The clock kept ticking. The pencil kept turning. The telephone remained silent. From somewhere down the corridor came the sound of hurried paper, pages being flipped, a drawer being yanked open and shoved shut. Then footsteps, fast but controlled, passing by without stopping. A figure moved behind frosted glass, blurred into a ghost of motion, then vanished. The man with the pencil finally set it down. The pencil lay on the table like a surrendered weapon. He stared at it, then at his own hand, as if confirming they were still his. A second hand swept toward the top of the clock face. The room leaned into that movement without meaning to. Muscles tightened, breaths were held and released in small, careful pauses. Somewhere, a bell rang once, distant, unsure, not meant for them, but it echoed in the quiet like a warning. The telephone did not ring. Yet. He looked at the clock again, not because it helped, but because it was something he could look at without showing fear. The second hand reached 12, hesitated for less than a heartbeat, and moved on. And as it did, he understood with sudden clarity that they were no longer waiting for news. They were waiting for time to run out. The first thing he noticed, once the room had accepted that the telephone would not save them from silence, was how carefully everyone tried to look busy. A door opened somewhere beyond the corridor, not with urgency, but with the practiced restraint of men trained to keep their movements quiet. The sound reached them in layers. The click of a latch, the soft scrape of wood against wood, a brief draft that carried in colder air and the smell of wet stone. Someone stepped inside and did not announce himself. He didn't need to. The chair legs shifted, heads lifted. A dozen eyes asked the same question without asking it. He placed a folder on the table as if it weighed more than paper should. The folder did not slam down. It was set carefully, like a fragile object, like an offering. Then he stood back, hands behind his spine, posture disciplined, face almost blank. For several seconds, no one touched it. In the space of that pause, the ordinary world tried to continue. The stove gave another faint sigh. A radiator ticked as metal cooled. A small leak in a pipe somewhere clicked at a steady interval. The clock kept going, indifferent. Then the man with the dry hands reached forward and opened the folder. Inside were pages stamped and restamped, inked signatures, thin carbon copies. Some of the writing was typed, some handwritten in hurried lines that looked like they'd been drawn by a shaking wrist. Numbers appeared, times, coordinates. He could feel the attention of everyone tightening around the paper, as if the room itself leaned forward. He read without moving his lips. Across from him, someone exhaled through his nose, too forcefully, then controlled it, as if the sound had betrayed too much. Another man reached for his tea, remembered it was cold, and put the cup back down without drinking. The motion looked like a mistake corrected mid-flight. They were in a place that had learned to live inside repetition. Every morning, the same corridors filled with the same boots. Every evening the same tired faces drifted toward the same bunks, the same cigarettes glowing briefly in cupped hands. Orders came and went, messengers arrived and left. Maps were unrolled, then rolled again. When men needed to believe things were stable, they kept routines stable. So the routine continued now, even with that folder open like a wound. A clerk entered with a stack of forms and paused, startled by the stillness at the table, then walked around it as if nothing unusual was happening. He set the forms down at the edge, nodded once. The papers remained. The world insisted on paperwork. A distant typewriter began to clatter in another room, rapid and confident. The sound was almost comforting, like rain. Someone was producing words that sounded like control. In the hallway, a young runner passed with a canvas satchel, his steps quick but measured. He avoided looking into the room. It was as if he feared that if he made eye contact, he might be pulled into whatever was forming here. He disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the building. The man with the folder turned one page, then another. He stopped at a line, stared at it, then looked up at the man who had delivered it. From where? The messenger hesitated only a fraction too long. Forward position, he said. The answer should have satisfied the question. It didn't. It never did. The room had become a place where every detail could be doubted, and doubt itself had become a kind of safety. Another man, older, with a collar that had been mended more than once, reached into his pocket and produced a cigarette he did not light. He rolled it between two fingers as if waiting for permission from the air. When none came, he put it back. At the far end of the table, someone tried to inject normality into the moment the way a nurse might adjust a blanket. If it's accurate, he said lightly, as if discussing weather, then it gives us, what? Several hours. No one challenged the optimism outright. They let it sit there, thin and hopeful, like a candle flame protected by a hand. Yes. Another voice answered. Several hours. Several hours. It sounded like plenty when said aloud. It sounded like comfort. It sounded like time. But he had watched the clock long enough to know how quickly several hours could evaporate when the world decided to move. A map lay folded on a side shelf. Someone unfolded it slowly, smoothing the creases with the flat of his palm. The paper crackled. Lines and symbols, borders drawn by men who believed borders mattered, routes traced with pencil, circles marking points of interest. The man leaned over it, fingertip hovering, not touching yet, as if touching might. He watched the others' faces as they pretended to examine. Some leaned in, brows furrowed with seriousness. Some sat back and made themselves look. No one wanted to be the first to speak the wrong sentence. This was normality under pressure. Men discussing movements, supplies, positions, as if they were not also discussing the shape of their own fate. A low hum vibrated through the building. Electricity, machinery, the subtle life of a facility built for coordination. It made the air feel charged, even when nothing happened, even when the telephone remained silent. From outside came the sound of distant engines, not close enough to name, just a murmur that could be mistaken for wind. It came and went. It returned again. Each time it returned, the men in the room paused for a fraction of a second, as if their bodies were listening even if their mouths refused to admit it. Someone made a joke, soft and brief, a remark about the tea being undrinkable, about the building being colder than a cellar. There was a small ripple of forced amusement. Two men exhaled. One gave a short laugh that ended too abruptly. The joke did what it was meant to do. It proved they were still human. It proved the world was still capable of triviality. Then the laughter vanished, and the waiting returned like water filling a gap. A hand reached for the telephone, not to use it, just to touch it, as if making contact with the object could coax sound from. The hand hovered above the receiver for a moment, then withdrew, embarrassed by its own instinct. He glanced toward the window. The man who kept lifting the curtain did it again. The same 2 fingers, the same precise movement. This time, he didn't lower it immediately. He stared longer. "What?" someone asked. The man at the curtain blinked, as if waking from a trance. He lowered it. "Nothing," he said. And then, after a beat that betrayed him, he added, "Just movement, movement." Another word that sounded harmless until it didn't. The older man with the mended collar cleared his throat. He spoke carefully, like a man stepping onto thin ice. "We should send confirmation." "Already sent," the messenger said. "And if it's delayed?" There was no answer to that. Not because no one could speak, but because they all knew what delayed meant here. Not just inconvenience, not just slower paperwork. It meant the world would continue without their understanding, without their readiness, without their approval. To cover the silence, another routine arrived. A tray of bread and thin soup, carried in by a tired orderly who looked as if he'd been awake for days. He set the tray down, nodded, and left. The smell of soup filled the room, warm and ordinary. Hunger flickered in a few eyes. No one moved to eat. The clock continued. Tick, tick, tick. The folder lay open. The map lay spread. The tea sat cold. The soup cooled slowly on the tray, its steam thinning into nothing. And through it all, the sense of stretched time grew heavier. Not an urgency that made men run, but a pressure that made them hesitate. Every action felt like it might be the wrong one. Every second spent deciding felt like a second stolen. He looked again at the telephone and realized the most frightening part was not that it might ring. It was that it might not ring until there was no time left to answer. The first sign that something was wrong arrived disguised as a correction. A junior officer stepped into the room holding a slip of paper no larger than his palm. He apologized before speaking, as if the words themselves were an inconvenience. His voice was steady, rehearsed by training, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the map, then away. "There's a discrepancy," he said. "Minor." Minor was a word that lived comfortably in places like this. Minor adjustments, minor delays, minor misalignments between expectation and reality. The room accepted it without resistance. "Which line?" someone asked. The officer glanced down. "Timing." The man at the table nodded once, already dismissing it. Timing could be corrected. Timing was flexible. Timing was not danger. It was administration. They returned to the map. The officer stepped back, still holding the paper, waiting to be dismissed. No one formally did. After a moment that stretched just long enough to make him uncomfortable, he turned and left on his own. The slip of paper went with him. Another sound joined the background chorus. A faint clicking from the ceiling. Irregular, metallic. Someone looked up, then away. Buildings made noises. Old structures complained. It meant nothing. A man at the edge of the room adjusted his watch. He tapped the glass lightly with a fingernail as if to wake it. The second hand moved. Satisfied, he lowered his wrist. Outside, the engine sound returned, closer this time, then fading again. A few heads turned instinctively, but no one spoke. If you didn't name a sound, it couldn't demand explanation. A message arrived by runner. Then another. Short note, clarifications. Each one carried a tone of reassurance. The bureaucratic language of control. Words like holding, awaiting, within expected parameters. The men read them, nodded, and stacked them neatly, as if order on the table could enforce order beyond the wall. One message mentioned visibility. Reduced, it said. Weather, someone assumed. Someone else said nothing at all. The man with the mended collar leaned closer to the map. He traced a line with his finger this time, not hovering anymore, following it slowly, deliberately. He stopped short of a marked point, then withdrew his hand, rubbing his thumb against his index finger as if trying to remove ink that wasn't there. "We've seen this before," he said quietly. "It settles." No one challenged him. Experience carried weight here. If a man who had seen other weights said this one would settle, then settling became the expectation. A distant door slammed harder than necessary. The sound echoed, sharp and out of place. For a brief moment, the room stiffened. Then someone cleared his throat, and the tension released. A clerk returned, this time with a ledger. He asked for a signature. The man at the head of the table signed without reading, his pen moving smoothly, practiced. The ledger left. Another small act completed. Another piece of normality preserved. The telephone crackled once. Just a flicker of static. Not a ring. Not a voice. Just enough sound to make every spine straighten. They waited. Nothing followed. Someone laughed under his breath, the sound more relief than humor. "Faulty line," he said. "Always has been," another replied. They resumed breathing. A thin layer of fog began to press against the window, softening the light outside. Shapes blurred. Distances shortened. The man who kept checking the curtain lifted it again and frowned, then lowered it without comment. He did not share what he saw, or what he couldn't. Another discrepancy surfaced, this one in numbers. A count that didn't align, a report that arrived incomplete. It was explained quickly. Transcription error, a smudge, a misheard figure. The explanation was accepted with gratitude. Errors that could be named were safer than those that couldn't. Time stretched further. Soup went untouched. Bread hardened at the edges. Cigarettes were lit now, one by one, the room filling with thin smoke that curled lazily toward the ceiling. The smoke moved more decisively than anything else, drifting, dispersing, refusing to stay contained. A man coughed and waved it away, annoyed not by the smoke, but by the reminder that air still moved freely, indifferent to plans. The clock reached another hour. No one marked it aloud. They all felt it anyway. Somewhere beyond the building, something shifted, metal against metal, distant and prolonged. It could have been routine transport. It could have been nothing. The men did not ask. The final warning arrived quietly, wearing the voice of reassurance. A message stated that everything was proceeding as expected. It was read twice. The paper was folded carefully and placed with the others. No one noticed that the phrase "as expected" no longer matched what the room felt. The warning signs were there, in the fog, in the static, in the corrections that kept arriving too late to matter. But they were gentle, almost polite. They did not shout. They did not demand attention. And because they did not demand, they were allowed to pass through the room unnoticed, like drafts through a cracked door, carrying consequences with them into the waiting silence. The realization that time had begun to behave differently did not arrive as panic. It arrived as compression. Moments that should have stretched now felt closer together, stacked one behind the other without space to breathe. A glance at the clock no longer reassured anyone. It simply confirmed that seconds were passing with the same indifference as before, even as everything else seemed to lean forward. A senior officer entered without knocking. He carried no papers. That absence drew attention faster than any document could have. He closed the door behind him, not sharply, not urgently, but with care, as if the room itself might fracture if startled. He stood for a moment, hands at his sides, eyes moving from face to face. No one spoke. No one offered him a chair. "There may be a delay," he said. "May." Another soft word, another cushion placed gently over a hard surface. "How long?" someone asked. The officer inhaled through his nose. Unclear. Unclear meant outside their reach. Unclear meant the machine was moving without consulting them. A man near the end of the table pushed his chair back an inch, then stopped, realizing the sound was too loud. He froze in place, half standing, half sitting, caught between action and restraint. Eventually, he lowered himself back down. The telephone remained silent, but its presence grew heavier, like an object gaining mass simply by being watched. One man wiped his palm on his trousers and reached toward it again, this time brushing the cord with his fingers before pulling back. He looked around, embarrassed, as if he had almost committed an indecency. Outside, the fog thickened. Light became directionless, pressing flat against the glass. The man at the window lifted the curtain and did not lower it this time. He stared out longer than before, his shoulders stiff, his jaw set. "Can you see?" someone asked. "Enough," he said. Then, after a pause that stretched too long to be casual, he added, "Less than earlier." The room absorbed this without comment. Vision narrowing was not yet danger. It was merely inconvenience. Another runner arrived, breath controlled but fast enough to betray effort. He delivered a message directly into the hands of the man at the head of the table. The paper trembled slightly as it was read. The man's face did not change. He folded the message once, then again, aligning the edges carefully. Precision had become a form of self-defense. "Forward elements are adjusting," he said. Nothing unexpected. No one challenged the phrasing. No one asked what kind of adjustment required such careful language. A decision hovered in the room, unspoken but felt. It was not a dramatic choice between extremes. It was smaller than that, subtler, a question of whether to interrupt the flow or let it continue a little longer, the kind of decision that feels safer if postponed. The older man with the mended collar leaned forward, elbows on the table now, the first breach of formal posture. His voice was low, almost thoughtful. "If we intervene," he said, "we risk confusion." Confusion was dangerous. Everyone knew that. Confusion led to missteps, misfires, accidents to be blamed on human error. It was easier to trust the process, introduce doubt. "And if we don't?" someone asked. The question was not accusatory. It was genuine, curious, almost philosophical. The older man did not answer immediately. He looked at the map again, at the lines he had traced earlier. He looked at the folder. He looked at the clock. If we don't, he said finally, we maintain continuity. Continuity. Another word that sounded like safety. A chair scraped softly as someone shifted position. The scrape was enough to make two men glance toward the door, as if expecting interruption. None came. The stove was cold now, the radiator silent. The building seemed to be holding its breath along with them. Outside, the engine sound returned, closer, steadier. This time it did not fade immediately. It lingered, a low presence that pressed against the walls. No one named it. Naming would require response. The man at the window lowered the curtain at last. He turned back to the room slowly. Still time, he said, as if reassuring himself more than anyone. Still time. The phrase moved through the room like a sedative. Another message arrived. This one carried no correction, no discrepancy. It simply confirmed receipt of earlier instructions. A closed loop, a system acknowledging itself. The man with the dry hands noticed that his palms were damp now. He wiped them again, more urgently, then folded them together to keep them still. A thought surfaced in him, unwelcome and sharp, that this quiet, this order, this restraint, was the final moment when interference was still possible without consequence. That beyond this point, any action would not prevent what was coming. Only change who would be blamed. He did not share the thought. No one did, because to speak it aloud would be to admit that the window was closing. The clock advanced another minute. The sound seemed louder now, though it had not changed. Tick, tick, tick. The senior officer shifted his weight. We should wait, he said. It sounded less like a recommendation, and more like a surrender to momentum. Heads nodded, one by one. Not eagerly, not in relief, but in acceptance. Waiting had become the decision. And somewhere, just beyond the fog and the walls and the careful language, the last opportunity to alter the course of events began to slip away. Not with force, not with alarm, but with the quiet certainty that no one was going to reach for it in time. It happened without ceremony. No alarm sounded. No voice cut through the room. No one stood or raised a hand or announced that something had changed. The shift arrived the way night does when no one is watching the sky. A message came in, shorter than the others, lighter in weight, carried by a runner who did not slow this time. He stopped just inside the door, chest rising and falling once before he spoke. His words were ordinary, too ordinary. Execution acknowledged, he said. Acknowledged. Not initiated, not confirmed, just acknowledged. The man at the head of the table took the paper and read it. He read it a second time, slower. Then he folded it and placed it on top of the others, aligning the edges with meticulous care. The stack was neat now, complete. No one asked what exactly had been acknowledged. The phrasing itself suggested finality without explanation, a door closing somewhere far away out of sight. The runner waited, as if expecting further instruction. When none came, he nodded to himself. His footsteps faded quickly, swallowed by the corridor. For a moment, the room did not react at all. The clock continued. Tick, tick, tick. The telephone remained silent, but its silence had changed. It was no longer expectant. It was settled. The older man with the mended collar leaned back in his chair. The wood creaked, louder than it should have. He did not correct the sound. He stared at the ceiling, then closed his eyes briefly, as if resting. Well, he said quietly, not relief, not resignation, just a word used to bridge a gap that could no longer be crossed. Someone reached for the soup at last. He lifted the spoon, tasted it, and frowned. Cold, he muttered, as if this were the only disappointment worth naming. He continued eating anyway. At the window, the man who had been watching lowered the curtain completely. He did not check outside first. He simply let the fabric fall, sealing the room off from whatever was happening beyond it. The gesture was small, almost polite. A chair was pushed back. Another man stood, stretching his arms, the way people do when they believe the worst part of waiting is over. His joints cracked softly. He looked around, unsure whether sitting again or leaving would be more appropriate. "Shall we?" he began, then stopped. There was no clear next action to suggest. The map was folded, slowly, carefully. Each crease pressed flat, each corner aligned. The act felt ceremonial, though no one treated it as such. When the map was returned to the shelf, it faced inward, its markings hidden. The stove was not relit. Someone opened a notebook and wrote a line, just one, then closed it. The fog outside pressed harder against the glass, though no one noticed now. The engines that had hovered at the edge of hearing were no longer discernible. Either they had moved away, or they had moved so close that they blended into the background of everything. The man with the dry hands realized his hands were shaking, not violently, just enough to make holding them still require effort. He clasped them together and rested them on the table. The wood felt solid, unmoving. A thought formed among several of them at once, unspoken but shared, that something irreversible had just been completed. Not by action, but by permission. By allowing the process to continue unchallenged for one moment longer than necessary. No one said it, because now, saying it would change nothing. The clock reached the next mark. Another minute sealed. The room, which had once felt like a place of waiting, now felt like a place that had been passed by, as if the center of events had moved elsewhere, leaving them behind with their papers, their routines, their careful language. Outside the door, somewhere deeper in the building, a mechanism engaged. A low sound, barely perceptible, like tension being drawn tight. Inside the room, men began to gather their belongings, not hurried, not afraid, just aware that whatever came next would no longer require their presence. They had crossed the line without stepping over it, and the waiting, so carefully maintained, so deliberately prolonged, had quietly transformed into something else. Something that could no longer be stopped. The room emptied slowly, not all at once, not with purpose. Men left in pairs or alone, taking their time, pausing at the doorway as if expecting to be called back. Each exit felt provisional, like stepping away from a bedside rather than abandoning it. When the door finally closed for the last time, it did so without sound. What remained was not silence, but a thinner version, the kind that still carries echoes of movement. Chairs slightly out of place, the faint warmth where bodies had been, the smell of smoke that refused to disperse. The clock kept ticking. Its rhythm felt different, no longer a reminder of waiting, but a confirmation that time had already committed itself to a direction. Tick, tick, tick. Each second was less a question and more an answer. The telephone sat untouched. Its receiver rested perfectly in place, balanced, satisfied. It would ring eventually, or it would not. Either way, it had been relieved of responsibility. The cup of tea remained on the table, skin long since broken, liquid cooled beyond usefulness. Next to it, crumbs from the bread lay scattered, ignored, evidence of appetite returning too late to matter. The folded map stayed on the shelf, its lines pressed together in the dark. Whatever they had once described was no longer subject to review. Ink does not change its meaning once the paper is put away. Outside, the fog thickened until distance ceased to exist. Sound lost direction. What little light remained flattened into a dull, colorless presence that seemed to press inward, testing the glass without striking it. Somewhere beyond the walls, beyond the fog, beyond the last opportunity to intervene, momentum continued its quiet work. No acceleration, no announcement, just movement sustained by its own weight. Inside the room, the stove sat cold. The radiator made no sound. The building had settled into stillness, not as a pause, but as a holding pattern that would not be interrupted. A faint vibration passed through the floor, subtle enough to be mistaken for imagination. Then another, so gentle it could be ignored, the kind of signal that does not demand attention, only acknowledgement. The clock's second hand approached the top of the face again. For an instant, everything seemed to hover there, the room, the fog, the unseen machinery beyond the walls. Breath held without lungs to hold it. The hand reached 12, and the waiting stopped.